الحمد لله القدير الباري ثم صلاته على المختار وبعدها كسيرة الرسول منظومة موجزة الفصول. Last week we stopped at the incident of Al-Sīra al-Mi'raj, and after this, as Al-Imam Ibn Abi al-Izz al-Hanafi rahimahullah wrote, he said, وَالْبَيْعَةُ الْأُولَى مَعَ 12 مِنْ أَهْلِ طَيْبَةٍ كَمَا قَدْ ذُكِرَ وَبَعْدَ 52 أَتَى 70 فِي الْمَوْسِمِ هَذَا ثَبَتَ. So in those two lines, he's talking about the two bay'ah, the oath that the people of Medina, Yathrib at that time, was not named Medina yet, and those people were not known as Al-Ansar yet. They are just people of Yathrib. And there were two main tribes, Al-Aws and Al-Khazraj. So before we talk about this big and important, and it is the most major event in the Seerah. Before we talk a little bit with more details, I would like to give a quick introduction about the lesson that inshallah we're going to learn and extract from this event. Briefly, it is about the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. SubhanAllah, the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a great sign to every one of us, to every person on this life. On the individual level, on the family level, on the society level, even the global level. We should sit and think how many times small incidents happen in our life. Either we cared or not about them, but those small events turn to be the most important things happen in our life. Many things, many choices we make just normally, we don't even think about it, and many years later it turns to be very important and turning point in our lives. And subhanAllah, this is how qadr Allah works, without us paying attention. Just one example, very clear example. It's in the Quran, in the story of Musa alayhi salam, in Surah Al-Qasas. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala started describing how bad Fir'aun was. إِنَّ فِرْعَوْنَ عَلَى فِي الْأَرْضِ وَجَعَلَ أَهْلَهَا شِيَعًا يَسْتَضْعِفُ طَائِفَةً مِّنْهُمْ يُذَبِّحُ أَبْنَاءَهُمْ وَيَسْتَحْيِي نِسَاءَهُمْ إِنَّهُ كَانَ مِنَ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described all the evil that Fir'aun has done. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَنُرِيدُ أَن نَمُنَّ عَلَى الَّذِينَ اسْتُضْعِفُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ. We want to bless those who have been weakened, the weak people. وَنُمَكِّنَ لَهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. We will make them the superpower. وَنُرِيَ فِرْعَوْنَ وَهَامَانَ وَجُنُودَهُمَا مِنْهُمْ مَا كَانُوا. And we will show Fir'aun and his ministers and his soldiers, we will show them what will happen from those weak people. So how this, we can imagine like how big it is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turns superpower, destroy superpower completely, and brings the weakest people to be the superpower, to beat that superpower. It's a major event in the whole earth. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after this ayah, said, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَىٰ أُمِّ مُوسَىٰ أَنْ أَرْضِعِيهِ. Just imagine, after all those big events that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said they will take place, how it started by revealing to the mother of Musa, just breastfeed him, and if you're afraid, throw him in the river. That's how, subhanAllah, that's the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it continues, of course, throughout the story, we see how the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through small and minor events, then major events came to true. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prepared the people of Yathrib even before they hear about the Prophet ﷺ. First of all, they used to live with some Jewish tribes in Medina. And of course, tension happens between them. And the Jewish people used to tell them, this is a time for a prophet. When he comes, we will follow him and kill you, destroy you completely as Ad and Iram. Ad and Iram, Ad and Thamud, the ancient Arabs, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroyed. We know their stories in the Quran. So the Jews are threatening people of Yathrib, the non-believers, idol worshippers at that time, that this is a time for a prophet. When he comes, we will follow him and we will kill you just like Ad and Iram. So basically you Arabs will disappear. Just like the ancient Arabs Allah destroyed completely, same thing will happen to you. So that's the first thing. The second thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prepared them to be Ansar, to be the protectors of the message, is that they had just a few years before they meet the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they had one of the most bloody wars between them, between the two tribes, Al-Aws and Al-Khazraj. Most of their leaders, most of their elders have been killed in this war. So subhanAllah, this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prepared them. Because what prevented Quraysh from accepting Islam? It made sense to them. It's convincing. But because they are following their elders. And subhanAllah, that's the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is extremely hard to change the opinions and the ideas of older people. It's not impossible, of course, but it is harder. And that's well known to everyone. It's easier to convince a young person than an old person. Much easier. So, this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we can see again the qadr of Allah. Nothing is worse than a civil war that most of their chieftains, most of their leaders have been killed. It is the worst thing to happen. But it turns to be one of the best blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon people of Yathrib. Because then their young people became the leaders and they accepted Islam. So how this all happened, the Prophet ﷺ now, as we said before in the last week and the week before when he went to Ta'if, he's trying to convince other people. So Quraysh, or the leaders of Quraysh, are not accepting Islam. Basically, some of them yes, but majority are not. So the Prophet ﷺ is seeking others now to accept Islam. And what he was telling them, very simple. من يؤويني وينصرني وله الجنة. Whoever accept أبلغ رسالات ربي, whoever protects me to convey the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I will guarantee them Jannah. That was the deal. That was the Prophet ﷺ was looking for this. And one of the main and well-known stories, when the Prophet ﷺ met Bani Shayban, and they used to live in Iraq area near to the Persian Empire, and they were one of the largest and strongest Arab tribes. And they were convinced by the message of the Prophet ﷺ. Anyone heard the Prophet ﷺ was convinced by his message. Obviously, it's the truth from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But other things play a role. So they discussed in very long conversation one of the points they said, and the one who said their military commander, Al-Mothana ibn Haritha, who became Muslim after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, he told the Prophet ﷺ, what you're calling us for, something that kings hate. Kings don't like what you're saying. This will free people from their power, from their control. And he means that we have a treaty with the Persian emperor. So that's why they couldn't accept Islam. And subhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ used to use any event that people gather in to call them and ask them the same message. من يؤويني وينصرني أبلغ رسالات ربي وله الجنة. And was with Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, the Prophet ﷺ with Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was well known of the ilm al-ansab, the lineage knowledge. So he knows every tribe from where, who are they go to what lineage and where they meet. So he knows some details, more details about people that help the Prophet ﷺ to convince them and to give them da'wah. So the Prophet ﷺ used to pick people that he thinks, he plans that, oh, those people are able to support the message. Those are strong people. They will benefit Islam. So none of those tribes accepted Islam. Then the Prophet ﷺ met 6 young people from Al-Khazraj. And the Prophet ﷺ did not plan to meet them, just met them. And the Prophet asked them from where? And they said from Yathrib, from Al-Khazraj. And the Prophet ﷺ told them, shall you sit down, I talk to you about this message? And the Prophet ﷺ talked to them. When they heard the word prophet and they heard the message, they talked among themselves and they said, هذا النبي الذي توعدتكم به يهود. This is the prophet that the Jews are threatening you for. So let's follow him before they do. And subhanAllah, those 6 people accepted Islam. Look at the qadar of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Without plan from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he conveyed the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as he commanded him. And those 6 people accepted Islam and they went back to Yathrib. And subhanAllah, every household in Medina heard about Islam by this time. They spread the message of Islam everywhere. And the next Hajj, 12 people came to Mecca to give the oath to the Prophet ﷺ. And this is what here in the first line, Al-Imam Ibn Abi al-Azz al-Hanafi mentioned, where he said, وَالْبَيْعَةُ الْأُولَى مَعَ 12 مِنْ أَهْلِ طَيْبَةٍ كَمَا قَدْ ذُكِرَ. So the first 6, they didn't have any oath. They just heard the message, accepted Islam, that's it. Now, the 12 that they came after this, they had a bay'ah. A bay'ah means oath of allegiance. But this oath, as it's called, bay'atun nisa, the oath for women, because the conditions of this bay'ah was exactly as the bay'ah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described for women. The ayah that I recited in the second rak'ah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّبِيُّ إِذَا جَاءَكَ الْمُؤْمِنَاتُ يُبَايِعْنَكَ. O Prophet, if female believers come to you to give you oath of allegiance, for what? What conditions? عَلَى أَلَّا يُشْرِكْنَ بِاللَّهِ شَيْئًا. They don't worship any but Allah. وَلَا يَسْرِقْنَ. They don't steal. وَلَا يَزْنِينَ. They don't commit adultery, zina. وَلَا يَقْتُلْنَ أَوْلَادَهُنْ. They don't kill their children. وَلَا يَأْتِينَ بِبُهْتَانٍ يَفْتَرِينَهُ بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِنَّ وَأَرْجُلِهِنَّ. Means they don't do any major sin, basically, anything prohibited. وَلَا يَعْصِينَكَ فِي مَعْرُوفٍ. And they do not disobey you in anything good. فَبَايِعْهُنَّ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُنَّ اللَّهِ. So the point or the difference between this bay'ah and the next bay'ah that will happen in the year after, when the Prophet ﷺ was 52 years old, is that the other bay'ah, 70 men came and 2 women, and their bay'ah included protection, included fighting. So, as we said, 6 from Al-Khazraj accepted Islam, and then they went back to Yathrib. Next Hajj, 12 people came to give the Prophet ﷺ oath, but without the condition of protection, without the condition of fighting. It's just accepting Islam and obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger. But the next year, when the Prophet ﷺ was 52, as he said, وَبَعْدَ ثِنْتَيْنِ وَخَمْسِينَ أَتَى سَبْعُونَ فِي الْمَوْسِمِ هَذَا ثَبَتَ. 70 men came and they gave the oath of allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ to support him as they support and protect him as they protect themselves and their wives and their children in Yathrib, in their place. That's very important part of the agreement. So, because we will remember this point when we talk about Ghazwat Badr, inshallah. The condition was to protect the Prophet ﷺ. يَمْنَعُونَهُ مِمَّا يَمْنَعُونَ مِنْهُ أَنفُسَهُمْ وَنِسَاءَهُمْ وَأَطْفَالَهُمْ. So they protect the Prophet ﷺ as they protect themselves and their wives and their children in Yathrib, in their place, not outside. So, and the Prophet ﷺ sent with them Mus'ab ibn Umair to teach them Quran. And obviously the names that accepted Islam from what then those people are known as Al-Ansar after that are very famous. One of them is As'ad ibn Zurara, the one whom in his house was Mus'ab ibn Umair living, and the first Jum'ah in Islam took place in the house of As'ad ibn Zurara. And by the work of Mus'ab ibn Umair, many people accepted Islam. Of them, the famous Sahaba, Asid ibn al-Hudayr, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh. And when those 2 people accepted Islam, all their sub-tribe accepted Islam completely. And by that time, Medina was ready to welcome the Prophet ﷺ. So, inshallah, next week we will talk about how the Prophet ﷺ prepared for Hijrah and what happened during Hijrah, briefly, inshallah. But by this time, most of people of Medina accepted Islam. If they did not, at least they are familiar with Islam. Islam is no longer a strange thing for people in Yathrib. So then the Prophet ﷺ commanded all the Sahaba to emigrate to Medina. And it was required for every Muslim who's able to make it to Medina to emigrate to Medina. It was like the first Hijrah was optional. The immigration to Abyssinia was optional. Whoever wants to. But the immigration to Medina is required. And every Muslim was able, other than those whom the Prophet ﷺ commanded to stay. And those are 2 people. Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu wa Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu. And inshallah, when we discuss next week how the Prophet ﷺ emigrated, we will understand why he commanded those 2 people to stay in Mecca. وجزاكم الله خير.